What really happened to the middle class of 1850? To understand what happened to the middle class of 1850, you first need to understand something that most people get wrong. That middle class barely existed before the Industrial Revolution arrived and turned the social order upside down. For centuries, Western society had operated on a brutal binary. You were either born into the aristocracy, inheriting land, titles, and generational wealth, or you were born into the laboring poor, condemned to a life of exhausting physical work with little prospect of escape. There was almost no one in between. Then came the machines, the factories, the railroads, and the steam engines, and everything changed in ways that no one had truly predicted or prepared for. Until the mid-19th century, there had been only two major classes in society: aristocrats born into their lives of wealth and privilege, and low-income commoners born in the working classes. But industrialization cracked this rigid structure open. Factories and modern businesses created intermediate positions like managers, secretaries, and accountants, positions that offered higher wages than traditional manual labor or factory jobs. For the first time in history, it was possible for a man born without a title, without land, and without a family fortune to carve out a comfortable existence through education, discipline, and professional skill. This was the birth of the middle class as we know it, and 1850 was precisely the moment when this new social group was becoming impossible to ignore. A growing middle class of managers, professionals, and merchants gained wealth and social influence because of factories and capitalism. These were the shopkeepers, the bank clerks, the insurance agents, the lawyers, the doctors, and the school teachers who populated the growing industrial cities of England, France, Germany, and the United States. One piece of evidence of this emerging middle class was the rise of retail shops in England that increased from 300 in 1875 to 600 by 1890. This explosion of commerce was not accidental. It was driven by people who had money to spend and the desire to spend it, consumers in the truest sense of the word, creating markets where none had existed before. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because this rise was not a clean triumph. The middle class of 1850 was a deeply anxious social group. Stuck in a new position in the middle of society, the new middle class was hostile both to the aristocracy and to the lower classes. They were angered by their political exclusion from power in a system that still favored aristocrats, yet they felt they had the wealth and education to deserve a political voice. They had achieved economic respectability but remained locked out of the corridors of political power. This tension would drive enormous political movements throughout the second half of the 19th century, from demands for electoral reform in Britain to the revolutionary upheavals sweeping continental Europe. The values this class cultivated were a direct response to their precarious position. The middle class valued cleanliness, discipline, morality, hard work, education, and good manners. Hard work and education enabled them to rise in life. They invested heavily in their children's futures, sending them to school rather than factories. Middle-class children did not work in factories. Instead, they attended school and in their free time engaged in self-improving activities, such as reading or playing the piano. The home became a sacred space, a refuge from the chaotic industrial world outside. Women of the household were expected to maintain this domestic sanctuary. In this new middle class, families became a sanctuary from stressful industrial life. The home remained separate from work and took on the role of emotional support, where women of the house created a moral and spiritual safe harbor away from the rough-and-tumble industrial world outside. Yet for all this apparent stability, the middle class of 1850 sat atop a deeply unequal foundation. Most economic historians agree that the distribution of income became more unequal between 1790 and 1840. The Industrial Revolution generated enormous wealth, but that wealth flowed unevenly. The rich who owned businesses became even richer. Middle-class factory owners were able to move into the upper class, while the poor remained poor. Wages from the factories were low. The workers who actually operated the machines, who loaded the ships, who dug the coal, they largely remained trapped in poverty, living in crowded urban tenements with no sanitation and little hope. Most working-class families lived in tenement housing, overcrowded apartment buildings with poor sanitation and ventilation, hotbeds of disease and social unrest. This inequality was not invisible. The people living through 1850 could see it all around them. Charles Dickens was writing about it. Karl Marx was theorizing about it. Reformers were protesting about it. The middle class itself was caught in this storm, prosperous enough to recognize the gap between rich and poor, educated enough to articulate it, but conflicted about which side of history they truly stood on. As part of these changing relationships, members of the new industrial middle class sought to close the distance between themselves and the new industrial upper class, while increasing the distance from the new industrial working class. These efforts by the middle classes to distance themselves from the working class inspired the establishment of political parties and other kinds of organizations designed to empower them politically. What really happened to the middle class of 1850, then, is this. It was born. It struggled. It built itself a cultural identity out of sheer will and anxiety, and it planted the seeds of everything that came after. The labor movements, the democratic reforms, the consumer economy, and the modern notion that social mobility is not just a dream but an achievable reality. It was messy, contradictory, and unequal, but it was also the beginning of a world we still live in today.